Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Stonebelt's webinar, It's Not So Different, Supporting People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and Their Families in Times of Grief and Loss. I want to welcome back our guest speaker, Reverend Bill Gaventa. You will learn more about him and from him here in a moment. I am your host, Reverend Sarah McKenney, the Spiritual Support Coordinator for Stonebelt. For those of you who may not know, as I know many of you are new to our webinars, Stonebelt is a service provider. We offer a wide range of support services for people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, as well as neurodivergent folks. We are located in Bloomington, Bedford, and Columbus, Indiana, and we are a secular organization. Therefore, we strive to support people of any and all faith or spiritual practices. And we are also a community-based organization, which means we promote full integration, inclusion, and belonging of people in their community. Now, before we dive in, I want to bring your attention to a few more things. Please note the donation site at the bottom of your screen, and I will also put it in the chat box here in a few minutes. We are offering our webinars for free, but we want to bring you quality speakers, so we do ask you to consider making a donation, please. So we've got one more webinar in the 2021 webinar schedule, the power of the word how, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in congregational leadership. That will be with Reverend and Dr. Joanne Van Sant in October. All of our past webinars, including this one, will actually be archived and the past ones are archived on our website. And that is at the bottom of the page. And you can also visit our Facebook page as well, is there. Our page, the website is growing. We provide resources, book suggestions, like I said, previous webinars, but then again, the resources, our postings on here are growing and changing, so check back often. If you are in our service area, please also check out the services that the Spiritual Support Coordinator, can provide you, including trainings, consultation, and that sort of things. If you're outside our service area, that's okay. Feel free to call me, email me, and I can try and assist you or direct you to supports in your area and try and answer those questions. There will be a question and answer time at the end of the presentation, but feel free to ask those questions throughout the presentation, and Bill and I will try and answer those as we go along as much as possible. If your questions are not answered, feel free to email me and email Bill. Bill will share his email address, and you can email any further questions that you have for us as well. The other thing that I do want to point out is the chat feature. You feel free to put in the chat who you are, where you're from, what brought you here, and anything else you'd like to share. You can save the chat and use as your resource and connections. So feel free to do that. Now, without further ado, the reason we came, this is Reverend Bill Gaventa. He is the founder and director emeritus of Institute of Theology and Disability, the current director of the National Collaborative on Faith and Disability, past director of Community and Congregational Supports at Elizabeth M. Boggs Center on Developmental Disabilities, past president of American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, editor of the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health. And you may see the image here, the author of Spirituality and Disability Recovering Wholeness, which also is a good site, a good resource for this topic of grief and loss, as there are some good chapters in that book talking and addressing the loss and grief for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. And Bill also trains clergy, seminarians, and community services staff on various topics. Bill, you do a lot. Please tell us more. Can't hear you yet.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay, sorry. I'll correct you on one thing. I am way past editor of the journal. There have been two sets of, they're in their second iteration now. I kind of got the journal when it was a toddler, and I edited, as I say, till they got to be a teenager, and now other people are taking it into adulthood. So that's been exciting to see. Welcome, everybody. It's a delight to be here. We're going to, this presentation this morning, we're going to go through, and it's got a lot of material in it. I'm going to skip some of it because some other things I want to do, or as we talk along, and I may try also to answer some questions as we go along or incorporate them into what I am saying. So let's get started. Okay, here we go. So things have really changed around people with IDD, intellectual, and grief. When I first started out 45 years ago as an institutional chaplain, people were rarely told, who were there were rarely told if somebody had died. In fact, a couple of my early profound experiences were getting calls from a social worker saying, "We just got a call from so-and-so's family and their parent had died, and would you go tell them?" And it was 6 months ago. So, you know, just a symbol of the disconnection between people and families. Death was kind of out of sight. Even at the developmental center, the kind of oral tradition was, don't go to the hospital building because if you go to the hospital, you're going to die, which is kind of like general society, people being afraid of going to the hospital. Then people would say people with IDD don't express grief or don't understand grief. They don't share grief like the rest of us. People didn't even think about how to support people with intellectual developmental grief, and it was a belief also that support or grief support had to be specialized in some way because there were so many, quote, special services supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that you thought you had to be specialized as well, which is I think one of the barriers that the whole era of special services created in the public, with this kind of sense that you had to be some kind of specially trained person to work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. If you want to read a wonderful article about that in general, if you've never read John McKnight's John Deere and the Bereavement Counselor, John Deere like the tractor, it's a classic article about the power of community as the place that supports grief. So in those old systems of care, death was kind of a symbol of loneliness and a loss of connection. Injustice, I mean, there was no power for people with intellectual and developmental disability to say about what they wanted or to be able to maybe do what they wanted. There very little kind of listening to people's choices, sense of abandonment, and family wounds that happened because of that. One of the early stories was a family who came to see me at that facility and wanted to go to the graveyard where their daughter was buried. And it was a beautiful little grave cemetery, little poplar trees and out on a hillside in upstate New York. But it was one of the old institutions, and each grave was marked by a stone with a number on it without a name. And so we went and stood at her grave, and the mother just, as you might imagine, just kind of went into huge kind of feelings of grief and loss about this number is the only sign about something that this person who was in our lives and whom we put in an institution because that was the professional, that was kind of what you did in those days. That's what it was. John Deere and the Bereavement Counselor. That's the name of the John McKnight piece. John McKnight piece. So people often did not usually participate in rituals of mourning. And I'm just going to say people. When I say people, instead of saying with IDD during this, I assume that that's what you're going to hear what I'm saying. Others were being protective, thinking, oh, they couldn't handle the grief or going to a funeral. Any of us who've worked in this arena for a while will have had the experience of someone's family member dying and hearing that the family would prefer that their son or daughter did not come to the funeral. And why? They wanted to protect them, maybe thinking they wouldn't understand, or they might get upset, or they might upset the funeral or whatever. But the trouble with that, of course, is that their grief for being part of that community is then just disenfranchised, is one of the words in grief that happens. And in my experience, and maybe the family or people didn't know how to support that person, but most people in that situation would have a support staff who could come with them and support them and be along to help the family and help that. And often in my experience, their presence has often been one of the most powerful things and to help the whole mourning process for a number of people. Now things have changed. We live in a world of losses. We see them everywhere. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience them all the time. In a system, even though that's based on growth and development, we have staff changes, people come and go, their moves, and you see things, people watch TV, you see, people know that death is around them and that there are losses around them in many ways. And it's also important here to remember that most people, 75% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live at home, not in facility settings, but live at home. And hopefully many of those are still connected to family. Now we recognize that unexpressed grief can come out and act by acting out. It can really, and that's true for anybody, disabled or not. You maybe have seen that in your own society. I remember that clearly from the first couple of funerals that I did as a pastor, and some things that got acted out by the family because of issues that had not been resolved before the mom's death. Too often it's bring on the professional grief counselor, and that's what the John McKnight article speaks to. And with COVID, of course, there's this huge awareness of the tragedy of isolation and of loneliness when people go to the hospital and others can't come to see them, and not being able to support people at times of loss and grief. So if inclusion and belonging is the key in supports and services of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, then why not here? Why not here? Why not here? Now, there are new challenges. I think people who work with people with disabilities closely and see them facing death or facing an illness or cancer or something like that, there's often, as allies, there's kind of this kind of experience that, why do they have to deal with that? It seems like a double injustice. They got a disability in life, but now they have to die, or that just doesn't seem fair. So there's an argument, a theological and existential argument that goes on with that. Aging, disability, death, they're not usually seen as blessings in our society and culture as a whole. And so you put them together, and the irony of that, of course, is the chances are that each of us will spend at least 6 years of our lives with some form of disability, usually as we get older and as we age. And then the crises now, when grief or death or loss or a crisis happens, a sudden death, you're going to have all kinds of feelings reverberating through a system, through a family, through group homes, through an agency. through a day program. And that can come out sometimes, if it's not, grief is not addressed, as anger at other staff, or anger at family, or family anger at staff, or be it are related to other kinds of losses that are going on. I had a staff member in New Jersey once tell me that if an agency did not address the grief and loss when somebody moved from a group home, say, to a nursing home, or a death in a group home, that within 6 months, most of the staff would have turned over uh, uh, because of not feeling adequately supported, or having that dealt with. And part of that is because there's a lot of pressure in systems to move on. When someone dies, there's this, people want to say they either say they still don't understand. Well, wait a minute. We say people with intellectual and developmental disabilities understand, but it takes a longer time for them maybe to understand in some ways. So we need to give them more time, give them more opportunities to share, to learn, to experience that grief. But the pressure on the system is to fill the bed and to fill the slot because of waiting lists. So you've got this thing about this tug and pull about let's go slow down versus let's go faster. And for sure, any experiences of death and loss highlight the issues that the most important thing in any agency or services and community with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is relationships. It's not program. We can run the best program in the world, but in that, if it's a good program, there'll be great relationships there. But it's the relationships that are really so important. We so often in the systems think, oh, it's the program. Our programs are great. Well, our programs are only great if the relationships are good, and people are responding to one another and learning and growing and doing things together. So the perfect storm. The current in our systems of care is toward growth and development and potential new life. End of life until recently was kind of not in the plans, although now people are realizing the first wave of people, younger adults who've moved into group homes several decades ago, are now aging, and death is becoming more frequent. When it happens unexpectedly in a system, it too often becomes a critical incident report, which too often assumes that something happened here was somebody's fault. Now, sometimes it is, but what happens when it's labeled as a critical incident report is the paperwork and the investigation kind of compounds the experience of a community rallying around an individual or family or staff to deal with the grief and the loss that there. In fact, it kind of compounds it in some ways. You know, here I am feeling this grief, and yet what people are thinking is that somehow I did it. So if we all feel guilty when someone close to us dies, and for some reason or another, that kind of system pressure can just kind of compound that. And in our general healthcare system, of course, the currents are toward healing, cure, and fix. Death and disability too often are seen as enemy or evidence of failure. We can't fix that. We can't do something about that. And then finally, hospitals are too often really dangerous places for people with multiple disabilities, partly because it's hard for many medical staff to see a person with multiple disabilities as a person with a valued quality of life in a circle of relationships. Too often the judgment is, what kind of quality of life does this person have? Would they understand? They're in a hurry in hospitals. They can't take time to communicate with staff or other people. That's a whole nother story. And families and other people will tell you that it just, because of attitudes and cultural attitudes that get embodied there and are still there in medical staff, a person with a severe disability can't just be sick in a hospital and their sickness be treated. They're often gets compounded with people's attitudes about their disabilities and what should be tried and done. So what do? Recognize first, loss and grief is going to be here, whatever the level of disability. Losses come in many forms: deaths, ends of relationships, staff change, caregiver change, moves moves from a family home to a residential facility, which is one of the awful things that happens when plans have not been made for where somebody's going to be living if they've lived at home with their family for years. Because what happens often in that situation is the person has to make two things, has two great things happening. The loss of a parent that causes the move, and the move out of the house, out of the place where that's been your home. Change of valued routines, loss of pets, loss of friends. It can just come in many forms. Supports need to be inclusive, but also person-centered and family-centered in their cultural and religious context. People handle death in lots of different ways. Cultures do, faiths do, and one of the things that happens there is you've got in agencies is you've got staff from many different cultures often and faith traditions working with people. So that's one of the important reasons for an agency, for people to talk about what they expect and hope staff will do and how to support each other and the people they support, and have people to support those staff. Either other staff in the agency, people like Sarah, who's a spiritual supports coordinator, or relationships with local clergy and others who can be a support to an agency, because we really don't, in most systems, know how to deal with grief and loss. And the huge paradox, of course, is often, in my experience, that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often better at sharing grief and feelings than we are, or people like I am. And a story about this loss in terms of staff change. I saw somebody's on here from Heritage Christian Services, and someone from them told a story at a workshop that I helped do for them a long time ago about they took a woman who'd been in services and supports in their agency for quite a while, a woman who had physical support needs with fairly severe CP. And this was trying to address issues of staff turnover. And they looked at her records and figured out that they got to the number of 500 people who had been in her life as a caregiver, and then they stopped counting. So if you think of that kind of loss of people who may be involved in intimate caregiving relationships with you, it's after a while, it's no wonder maybe sometimes that people either just get numb to stuff or distrust relationships, or even the miracle is are glad to have new staff and to let them work with them. So guiding principles for all this: reverse the questions. Anytime you ask a question about how can we support the grief of, or what do we do with this person with intellectual and developmental disabilities in this situation, ask how you would do it with anybody else. Be inclusive there. How would you do it with anybody else? What would you do with anybody else? And then kind of start from there. Recognize that none of us completely understands what death means. To say they don't understand death, well, that would be a case for most of 99.9% of us, I think, in some kinds of ways. And that we all finally act out our grief, usually, but not always, in family and culturally accepted ways. When someone dies, when someone's in hospital, in mourning, we send flowers, we send cards, we go to visit, we go to a wake, we go to a funeral, and maybe go to a cemetery, we contribute to memorial funds, we try to support family. Those are all ways of acting out our feelings of grief and loss in ways that we see in our cultures and faiths as appropriate. So there are ways to do that. So how do we help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who maybe have not had the kind of practice some of us, or most of us, who've had, by the time I get to my age at least, the practice to help to be part of those rituals and those cultural activities? And that's where good staff and caregivers come in who can support an individual along with the family if need be. And remember, nonverbal supports may be more important than verbal supports. You've been part of funerals where it's just the hug, it's the handshake, it's the people giving you a handkerchief, it's the just your being there. Those are the nonverbal kinds of things that are so important. Participation beats understanding. uh, in terms of intellectual understanding all the time, I think. So what to do? Pull in the people who've been supports in the past and present. If you're a pastor or in a congregation or working in an agency, who's this person been close to? Or who are the people in their group home or somewhere else being close to? If they've been living at home, who have been their friends and other people besides family? Support the people who are supporting those persons. One of the honors, but also tragedies I had when working in New Jersey was that I didn't work directly in an agency like Sarah. I would sometimes get called by an agency to come in because somebody had just suddenly died. And I was glad to be called, but the tragedy about that was they didn't have anybody already set up whom they could call, who people there knew. And so who do you call? We might say when you're in a situation like that, you usually call somebody you trust, or you want the people you know are close to you. The power is in the community of mourning and support, not just in an individual relationship. Over time, it takes time, remember, for everyone. We, quote, typical people get in trouble because we can think we can get through the process and hurry on quickly and get back. People feel the pressure to get back to kind of typical. And just, and we all, I think, have now learned enough to begin to think of grief as circles and mourning as not straight lines. You don't get over it, you get through it. And with help with people who receive your mourning and help to mourn with you and come out hopefully on the other side and to live with that. So we need then for a person to know what a person or family's traditions are for handling loss. If a person comes into Sarah's agency at Stonebelt, I would hope that in the intake they would find out what their faith traditions are, maybe what their traditions have been around loss in their family. I think, has this person lost close friends? What happened? And that also opens the opportunity there for the people like Stonebelt to say, well, here are things we do when somebody loses a family member and they're one of the people who we support or in one of our residential programs. And we want you to know that up front. And that's a way up front to say loud and clear, we think the most important thing is for a person to be involved as much as possible in the grief and loss process, and we'll support you and support them in that. Use teachable moments every time you can to talk about grief and loss and death when people have questions, just like we do with kids or anybody else. Help people prepare. If people, I wonder if it's ever been a learning task in a special ed programs or in day programs or in life experience training for people with disabilities about what happens when people die or when they to talk about things. Go to visit a funeral home or a cemetery. Help people help think about looking at pictures. I mean, again, it's the physical acting and beginning to have people have a chance to ask their own questions. For agencies and as family, if you're family and somebody's living at home, hopefully you've got some kind of support in the community, either hopefully a parish, a church, a faith tradition, or other people. And those are the people you would usually expect to respond if there was a death in your family. For an agency, I mean, creative strategies I've heard about are building an anticipatory kind of grief team that can respond to a loss in an agency. And if you don't have a chaplain or a spiritual support coordinator on staff, working with local clergy who know your people, staff, relatives, others who feel comfortable and a sense of call about how to support not just other friends of that person who maybe is in the end of life stages or the friends of people of someone who died, but being able to respond to everybody. And then, of course, provide opportunities and rituals for closure as much as possible. Giving people chances to say goodbye, giving people to say thank you for all for a friend you've been, the things we try to do, we encourage all of us to do, which those are other folks need those as well. So key strategies: recognize it, welcome it. Granger Westberg's famous saying about grief denied, delayed is grief denied, and grief denied is grief delayed. Create a safe place for it, a sanctuary, places where people can talk about it, maybe a grief and support group, whatever. Be alert for behavioral expressions about ways that feelings might come out. Assist in appropriate behavioral expressions, cards, photos, looking at pictures, letters, talking about feelings, sending flowers, taking food. I always had this image of an agency like Stonebelt. If there's and then you run a number of maybe residential homes, if there's a death in one home, all the other homes and friends from their day programs and others cooking the casseroles and bringing it to that other home, just like we do in many cultures about coming and supporting people and around. I'll tell you a story. We had one of my CPE students in New Jersey was working in a local ARC. And there was a guy there who had just moved, not been there not too long, who had moved from a psych hospital there. He had been there because of acting out issues, and he started to have the same kinds of issues at the home and got angry and punched a hole in a wall and things like that. And people were beginning to worry that they could not, quote, handle him there, and they were going to have to send him back to the psych hospital. And our CPE student got involved and started to get to know him, and finally found out that we were coming up upon near Thanksgiving, which was a year ago. He had been living at home with his mother when she had died, and he had not gotten to go to the funeral or to the cemetery. The emergency placement was some kind of institutional placement, maybe might have been the psych hospital or somewhere. And then he ended up at a psych hospital because of what people saw as behavioral issues, and then probably with all kinds of medication, then ended up at the ARC. And he was part of Thanksgiving was coming up, and that was a favorite holiday in their family. And so you had this scenario staring her in the face. So she started talking, and she said, well, how about, would you like us to do a memorial service for her here? And you help me plan it. And they did exactly that. And she helped create a memory box and some other things with him. And they had the memorial service. She and he together cooked the food for the refreshments afterwards. His favorite dish of his mom's was mac and cheese, and that's what they cooked. And invited people from the home and other people he had met from the day program and did that. And I don't know the end of the story, but I know in the immediate months afterwards, the levels of his behavioral outbursts just dropped dramatically, simply because people had finally paid attention. And hopefully maybe he eventually got to go to the cemetery and some things like that. So, think about, just how the way grief can work through. Accurate and honest information. Don't use euphemisms, particularly for people with autism, as we'll talk about in a little while. Enable, again, maximum support, involvement in the social and spiritual activities, maybe including planning. And that there's some good materials now out to help adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities plan what they would like their end of life supports and things to look like. Keep connected with key supportive relationships. Try to help people still keep connected with important relationships in their lives, even if they have to move into a residential setting. Relationship. That's what community is. It's not location, it's relationship. And then again, maximize the opportunities for expression and grief. The title is old, but it's a great book. Jeffrey Kaufman, Helping Adults with Mental Retardation Mourn. It's a great book. And that's some of his key strategies. So talk with other families and people and see what kinds of experiences they've had and what they've seen, and maybe out of that, what they would like to see happen. Work on individual rituals of loss and celebration. If someone dies in a group home or an agency supports, a family may have a funeral and people get, hopefully their friends get to go. If and there, I've seen creative things where people said, could we bring a number of people from the day program, at least maybe come to the wake before the usual wake hours with other people there, so we all get to be there to be able to be part of the funeral. You want people's friends, but that can also, clergy or others who are involved, some of the most creative and profound rituals, funeral rituals and memorial rituals I've done have been back in a day program or at a group home where you, maybe the family had a funeral, but then they wanted to have a memorial service back at their day program for the person that they lost there, and where you give people there the chance to join in the planning and in the leading of that service. And if you, that's the kind of service where if you ask, can you tell us why you like, what do you like best about Bill or John or Sarah? And you're going to get just the profound kinds of sharing that you would hope would happen in other kinds of rituals of mourning. Pre-visits to places where those rituals take place. Involve people in some way in the planning and leadership of services, having them have a chance to speak or to do a reading. And then plan individualized ways of remembering and memorializing. Pictures, photo albums, memory boxes, celebrating anniversaries with favorite foods, just as creative as you can be. A number of years ago, the Park Ridge Center did a thing on the challenges of aging, pulling together the major spiritual traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and came up with kind of 5 spiritual tasks about aging. And these were them. These are to reaffirm covenant obligations to community, reconnect with people and friendships, thinking through blessing. How have we been a blessing to people, and how do we give blessing to people who are coming behind us? How do we honor people who are getting older with dignity and respect and appreciation? Some cultures do that very well. How do we maintain faith in the face of loss? And how do we help reconciliation to happen through things that need to be reconciled, that things to be let go, reunions that need to be happen, forgiveness that needs to be happen. And if you take those tasks for everybody and think about working with them as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities get older, how do we help them get reconnected to some relationships? How do we let them know, for instance, let me go back to that. How do we let them know that not only that they've been a blessing to us, we who have been their supporters or staff members or whatever, where do they, is there ending towards the end of their life, who is going to be the people in their lives who say, thank you for who you've been, for what you've taught us, for being, you know, our friend, or for the things I learned from you. I think that kind of professional mutuality there is the kind of thing, especially when we may say, well, we're not their friends or their close family. Well, but they don't think that. If you've been in their life for a long time, they're, you know, they think that you're one of your close people, and we can't hold the power about what that relationship is if we say, I get to create the boundaries here, or where, especially as somebody moves towards the end of their life. So the paradox for us as professionals and as people is, how do we embrace the paradoxes of aging and end of life? How do we help people to maintain a sense of honor and dignity when people are a lot of times worried about the indignity? You've probably heard people who are getting older like, well, I may be old, but I'm not disabled. You know, that tyranny, that kind of tyranny of pecking order about levels of ability. It's both blessing and a curse, towards the end of our lives, a time of new growth, but also a time of decay, a time for wisdom, but also possibly a time for senility and losing memories, and a time of re-engagement in some ways at a time but for renunciation. So part of the question for all of us is, how do we help the people we know with intellectual and developmental disabilities think about those tasks as well? The paradoxes of our roles at this time of life for people. Again, staff, family, and/or friend. We are whatever we're. If again, like I said already, if we're staff, as people move towards the end of life, people who are dying or facing the end of their lives, or when someone in an agency has died and staff are feeling that mourning, that loss too, is there what's wrong with their sharing those feelings with their friends who are sharing that? I did a workshop at an agency once, and I talked about that, and there were staff from 2 different group homes, and one of them said, "Oh, we're not supposed to do that. We were told by our supervisors never share those kinds of feelings," whatever. And the other group home said, "Oh, our supervisor said it was fine. We should feel free to share that." So again, think through the policies and practices about what's human and what's kind of makes that as much a human time for everyone as possible, because the labels disappear in those times of end of life and mourning. How do we be with people at the same time as doing for? The classic paradox of pastoral care and spiritual care. How do we care for people's needs as well as celebrate their gifts, help them know their gifts and help celebrate their gifts in services or memorials? How do we both help people have the specialized supports they may need, but how do we also, as professionals in particular, learn how to give away things to other people that other people can do better than we can? Like the agency that I worked in Rochester, when people had friends outside of the facility and came to see them, I could have been the best chaplain in the world, but I would have been dropped like a hot potato because their friend was coming to see them. It was their friend or their family. It's those kinds of relationships. And how do we as professionals help people maintain those relationships so it doesn't depend upon, quote, just professional services to provide those key things? And here's the professional task that's the most important of all, I think, is how to know what we don't know and use that to invite other people in. So if we're an agency and don't know much about handling grief and loss, how do we invite people from a hospice or a congregation to build up relationships where we begin to work together so that we have the kinds of supports in place for people? There are lots of good resources out there. These are just a few of them. You'll get them in the PDF or the PowerPoints. There's a longer list that's out there as well. There's a beautiful website in Australia for end-of-life issues around adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Sarah's got a list, and we got a bigger. There's some, and I've sent her the larger list over on the left, updated a bit, that you can get from her. The creative things that happen in the UK, these books beyond words are these adult social story picture books, not with kids, but going through life experiences with no text. There's a suggested text at the end, but a storybook where you can go through sitting with somebody and talk about what's happening in the picture and talk about the story and talk with a person through what's going on. Again, there's a suggested text if you want it, but the whole idea is to get a conversation going. And one of them is about a friend of theirs at an agency who starts to have dementia, or when mom died, and when you could tell it's UK, when mom died, when dad died, am I going to die when somebody dies? And these are just a few of the kinds of resources that they have related to lots of other kind of life events as well. I think they're kind of fat. We need something more equivalent like that here in the States, but you can get them. Now, in the last few years, I've been helping on a project that's moving towards creating a national website for autistic adults on grief, loss, and end-of-life issues. An Autism Foundation is funding that, and the Hospice Foundation of America is doing it. It's not up yet, but we're getting, when you get more specific into autism, some people with autism, autistic adults would say, Bill, no, you're not quite right. It's not just the same. Because people with autism would say, wait a minute, there are other kinds of issues here that face us in particular. The characteristics of autism that involve maybe persistent defects in social communication and social interaction. So Bill has just said here, make sure people get to be in the community as much as possible around people. Well, that just may be really hard for some people on the autism spectrum. People maybe have restricted or repetitive patterns, misspelled there, sorry, patterns of behavior and interest. It's the important thing for us there is to remember that those patterns are same things that bring people comfort. Just like you and I, when we twirl a pencil all the time or play with our glasses or whatever, that those are always symptoms may be there early on, and they get in the way of kind of everyday functioning. Those are some of the major characteristics of autism. And there's a huge spectrum there in terms of intellectual understanding and ability. But some of the symptoms, some of the characteristics may be, and I don't say will be, but decreased eye contact, uneasy resistance to changes in routines. So think about the ways that an end of life changes a routine for somebody. Think of that, just can be a whole nother thing in itself in terms of grief and loss. Could be marked by hyperactivity or passivity. I read an article just this week from an autistic woman who said, I didn't want to be with people. I wanted to be alone, but I wanted people to be with me when I needed them and wanted them or whatever. So, and to be aware that typical signs of affection, issues about invading space are crucial, and then and that means we're also working closely with somebody who knows somebody to understand their nonverbal ways of communication and what they're communicating in that. So what things it may look like, looking down, not looking at you, not answering right away, not wanting to be touched, repetitive actions, making noise, again, these might look like, it's never everywhere. The spectrum is huge. The whole phrase about when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism really applies. But it highlights here that their universal dimensions of grief for all of us also need to be very individualized. Each of us has our own strategies for dealing with grief, for knowing and adapting. And so how do we adapt supports to what we know about each individual who might have autism? To remember there are no universal stages. And don't expect people to process people through some kind of stage thing. It's a roller coaster. To support people with autism by saying whatever you feel is normal for you and could be perfectly just a different way of doing what other typical quote people do. Remember, again, losses. A loss of a pet may even be more highly important here if that pet has been kind of the emotional support animal for somebody in a social system that may be limited. And think about the kinds of symptoms that might come out. So for people with autism, there may be no outward change of behavior, but it doesn't mean there's a lack of understanding or sadness. Assume competence. Assume that people get it somewhere. Just too often assume they wouldn't understand or should be protected. again, goes back to disenfranchised grief. It can cause regression and anxiety and stress and disconnect from feelings. Yes, that can be heightened for people with autism, but it can happen with anybody. Cause all of us to regress and anxiety, anxious. It's just a heightened form of that. Sometimes increases behaviors, and there may be more uncertainty about the social and cultural rituals related to grief and mourning. So giving them supports of people they know and working with them individually about what parts they want to be part of is even more crucial in that. Again, so strategies: be clear and explicit with words. Don't use euphemisms. Passed away means, well, what do you mean somebody passed? You know, I got that car passed me on the road. You've got to be specific and concrete. Not sleeping, those kinds of things. Repeat as needed. You need to repeat that something is that what's happened, and make sure you're not being blamed. This is not your fault. It's not your fault that this has happened. Be clear about what's going to happen next and offer choices about how to proceed in coping. So to be clear, if ritual is really important for people with autism and typical folks sometimes, but often, be clear about what's going to happen so they know what's going to be happening in the days ahead. Provide reassurance and openness about your feelings. Model, in a sense, for people how it is to share, and maybe that means doing something with people, like some of those behaviors, writing cards, giving flowers, etc. And address the sensory challenges, maybe that would happen with a visit to a hospital or a funeral home, a different environment. Again, providing a companion who's trusted and known, and maybe providing an opportunity outside of the first big social opportunity where there are lots of other people there is a way to help people get accustomed and provide. Remember the rituals. They're important ways of acting out grief. Help a person learn about those rituals as they come up in daily life. Give choices about what to attend. Help clergy and funeral directors to know what to expect in terms of a person's typical behavior, and reassure them that that's all right and that you'll have people there to support them with that. But if someone is there rocking because that's the way they're feeling sad, or needs to be standing in the back doing something, that's going to be okay. That person is on the edge, but he or she is participating. And if they've got support around, then it's not the clergy's problem, but the funeral director's problem. But they know they've got support. And then again, how do we help develop individual rituals? In other words, do what you would with anybody: educate and explain, communicate about typical behaviors in kind of both directions, to people with autism. In other words, what people do in grief, but also to other people about how people express their feelings. Model, give people choices, provide choice, and reflect and process afterwards at their own speeds. Now, this project is also looking for stories by people with autism about their own grief and loss experiences. And if you know somebody, they'd love to have an interview with them, because part of the site is going to be full of, hopefully, quotes or short clips from adults, autistic adults, talking about that process, not people like me talking about that process. And anything they use will be totally under their control. But if you know people, either good experiences or things they wish hadn't happened, we learn from that as well. So if you know somebody who might be interested, send me an email and I'll get you in touch with the right person. So, and there are lots of online resources around autism and grief as well, and some books written by autistic adults on that as a whole. So that's that. What kind of questions do we have in a little bit of time? Sorry. Any other questions?
Thank you, Bill. Does anybody have questions for, I'm really excited about this project.
Yeah, we've had a hard time getting finding adults with autism who are willing to talk, and particularly from minority communities.
Mm.
So if anybody, I think we, again, I've been terrifically impressed with the team that's doing this. The Nancy Lurie Marks Family Foundation in Boston, an Autism Family Foundation, is the one funding it. But the team that's developing all this stuff, they're using a graphics firm that employs autistic adults to do some animated shorts.
Oh, wonderful.
They're doing social stories. They're listening to critique from autistic adults and trying to listen hard. And there are wide ranges of opinion in that community, just like there are in other communities around grief and loss. So they've really used feedback and been trying to be very respectful of what people think. So people don't have to do it if they don't want to, but if you know somebody, encourage them to give them a chance and see if they feel okay about doing it.
So I have a few questions. This will be recorded, and what I will do as soon as it is pieced together and put on our website, I will send you all a follow-up email with the link, direct link to this recording. And then I will also send you the PDF version of these slides that you saw, my slides and his. And then that way you have all, and I'll also send you another list, more of a list of resources as well. So hopefully you all will have lots of resources at your fingertips.
Sarah, one point, for people who know congregations that run fairly good sized special needs ministries, inclusive ministries, or whatever, again, think about what's important for that whole ministry to do when someone gets to the end of life. Consider those people a member of your own congregation, but then you may, hopefully their friends or whatever from the church and others could come to whatever kinds of services or things are there, but the staff of that ministry and other people in the church may need to work really closely with families and others to work on how that might happen and to ensure people that that's going to be okay, because it will be hugely important. Again, because you just don't want people saying, what happened to John?
Right.
What happened to somebody? So again, and I think one of the great things about the last few decades is that there are a lot of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have become beloved people known in their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've heard of funerals where someone like with Down syndrome or something as big in Special Olympics, had 400 or 500 people show up. So
Exactly.
we
And
just got to remember the impact of people and on other people's lives, and that's so think about the circles that ripple effect will impact.
And if you are a pastor at a particular congregation, or if you're a chaplain at hospice or a hospital, and you have somebody, reach out to, if you know that they live with or are supported through an agency, reach out to that agency, ask questions, ask who their supports team members were. We would rather you reach out and ask those questions and try to intentionally include their friends and their community and get to know that person more than not. So please feel free to reach out and ask questions.
And most times if people with IDD are in a hospital, they may have a staff person with them, unless it's COVID.
Correct.
These days. But think about as chaplain or minister, the ministry is to that staff person as well as to the individual and the family. That may or that staff person. And there's some people beginning to finally do some things like recognizing, like emergency rooms are really hard for people with autism, as they are for anybody else. But think of all the, what's going on. So there are people beginning to do some training for hospital staff around what having people with autism come into an ER.
Yeah, Amy, I see your question, and Bill, do you know? I don't know of any specific trainings that are out there. However, you may reach out to your local local agencies that to see if they would do a training for your ER staff or nurses.
Yeah.
Or even though they're not necessarily out there, reach out, see if they'd be willing to do it.
And the other thing is work with the local autism society or something like that, and say, maybe you all let's think of something. So this autism society could work along with they would be people who could help provide some training, and certainly listen to people's experiences and help them learn. If you send me an email, I could one of the a chaplain who's involved in this autism and grief process has done some of that kind of training, and she could probably help alert people to that. In fact, she and I did a webinar or two on grief and loss with people with IDD. It's on the ACPE website under resources, and I can probably get you that link if you want to see what Maggie did with that.
And Bill, if you send that to me, I can include that in my follow-up email for everybody.
Okay, I'll find that. Yep. Okay.
Let's see.
The whole irony about all this is that when we do what we need to do to support folks, either with autism or IDD, you end up at heart, what you really end up doing is that this is what support looks like or should look like for everybody. That's the kind of irony and beautiful paradox in all this. I'll tell you quickly one of my favorite stories. A head of an ARC in New Jersey, retired, beloved guy, ex-priest, and he died a month later, totally unexpectedly, middle of the night. And I went to the wake at the funeral home and people were coming from the agency, just shook the agency to the core. And I got there about the same time as a van carrying several people from one group home, two of whom were in wheelchairs, the other person using a walker. And their anticipation and their grief when they got there, they all fell apart just walking in the door. And the young staff with them just got terrifically embarrassed, and the kind of first image would think was, maybe we should just go and leave. And luckily I kind of was able to say, well, let's you go talk to her, I'll talk to him, talk to her, separate people, give them a chance to be heard and feelings heard, and then let's give them a choice. And of course, after a while, they quieted down, and every one of them then wanted to go in and see Tom was there. And one of the older guy with the wheelchair walked down the aisle, turned toward the open casket, and Tom's wife and daughter were sitting on the front row. And this guy said what everybody there and in that whole community was feeling. He looked at Tom and said, "This is just no damn good." And the kind of way in which that profoundly spoke what so many people were feeling. I mean, those are the kinds of things that can possibly happen, that where you get to the early essence of what it means to be shared with one another in a community.
Absolutely. Sometimes things are just spoken the way everybody else in the room is feeling. Yep. I don't know who asked this question about like COVID challenges or restrictions on especially like gatherings. I do know in our pipe in here, Bill, if you have some specific suggestions, but we do have in our archived webinars. Bethany McKenney Fox did a webinar on like virtual or digital worship techniques that were
Right.
more interactive and engaging techniques. So you could even apply some of those things that are in that webinar to a virtual type of memorial service, which I have done for folks here at Stonebelt. Gary, I see your question about like specifically maybe memory or health issues later in life, and tools and resources on helping those individuals with loss and grief.
One of the things there is, I don't know if people know about the whole life story thing, working with anybody, elderly adults or whatever, but there's some nice templates and so on for helping somebody kind of write and relive their life story as a way of kind of and helping, and if people's losing their memory, maybe from records or other people, they can find out more about that. Now, I'm not there yet, but it's interesting as I'm getting older, I find myself wanting to reconnect with people I haven't seen for years, you know, and I've got time to do that now, or maybe go revisit. I mean, I grew up in Nigeria. I would love to go back and visit where I can, but can't right now because of the kind of turmoil in parts of the country. But, you know, those kinds of things, how do we help people do that? And kind of living their life story is kind of is one of those strategies.
Together, reaching out to family members or friends to collect stories from others to add to a memorial book or box might be able to help to fill in some of those memory gaps. And you're also going to find some other resources in those books, and the resources that we have will work for memory.
I'm going to send you also one other thing that I did. I should have put in the slideshow, and I didn't. We had another CPE student who did kind of a grassroots spiritual assessment of all the people who were supported by the ARC of South Jersey. And she got staff to help her. Really, it was around finding out what was most important to people. And somebody else, a social work intern who knew how to do statistics and stuff like that, put it all in a table and stuff like that. And then they ran it through a Wordle process, the Wordle process. And you get this Wordle picture, and you realize that how many of those things were about either relationships or grief and loss, about, you know, or what's going to happen. And one of the things, if you are in agencies where people have come from institutions in the past, is they may have had significant friendships there, but once they moved out of the institution, very rarely get to see those friends who maybe have gone dispersed to the winds, except maybe if they're involved in a statewide self-advocacy conference or something like that. But, you know, how do we help people find those folks or revisit a place, even to say, God, I'm glad I'm not there anymore, you know, or something like that. But those are things that we can do.
Amy has said the autism and grief website that Bill has been talking about will include 2 online educational trainings for professionals, one about faith and spirituality and grief for clergy, and another about grief and autism for health and social service professionals. Both.
Yeah, I told you they were.
CEs.
I told you they were a good team. You know, they're willing to fill in the spaces of the things that I left out. So,
and it will be available spring of 2022. I'm excited, Amy. So thank you all. And again, if you have further questions, please email myself or Bill, and we will do our best to connect you to further resources.
And if you've had profound experiences in this area, write them up.
Yes.
Get them out the story somewhere. That would help. Or another thing is work with your local funeral director to help them be kind of prepared as well. So anyway, thank you all.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.